What's up, vinyl community? It's your boy Chris coming at you live as always from the man cave here on a Thursday afternoon. Ice cold beer. Got the day off, listening to some jazz, going through all my recent arrivals like I always do, which is usually how I listen to my records. I had a great day of listening yesterday, carrying it on today. Wanted to take the day to throw in a couple of videos for you guys. Well, for this first one, for those of you who do not know, June is Black Music Month, and February is Black History Month. June, perfect month to dedicate just to the wonderful music and contributions of African Americans. So many genres of music would not be the same, maybe wouldn't exist at all if not for African Americans. If you think about jazz, my favorite, obviously. Think about jazz and reggae and the blues and rock and roll as we know it. All genres owe, if not its existence, hip-hop as well. If not its existence, but its popularity and its success to the wonderful contributions of African Americans. So today, here lately, of course, I've been doing the 5 albums I just feel like talking about. So I'm continuing that with a Black Music Month feel towards it. And I wanted to go, basically I've got 4 lesser knowns and 1 more so known for this one. And it's just 5 records I just felt like talking about. 2 of them I've already listened to today, actually, which is what made me so much want to talk about them, obviously. First up, got Joe Henderson, Black is the Color, on Milestone. Let's give her some of that glare. There you go. Awesome cover. Mine also happens to be a promo copy, which I did not know until I just threw it on. Let's go ahead and let you guys look at that label. You guys know how I like to roll. It's a relatively recent edition. Relatively. Already been on my table a few times. I just can't get enough of it. It's got everything going for it. It's got a little bit of everything. It's got some post-bop on here. You got some post-bop on here. You got some fusion. You've got some soul, some funk. A little bit of avant-garde. Not quite free. I wouldn't go as far as to call any of it free, but some of it teeters towards free. Joe Henderson, like he did every album he ever played on, every session he ever played on, torches it, sets it on fire. One of the greatest, most underappreciated saxophonists of all time, in my opinion. So, a little backstory. Black is the Color. This glorious record here came out in 1972, and it's on Milestone Records. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's probably going to be because it's on Milestone and not on Blue Note, because I think most people are familiar with Mode for Joe. You know where I'm going with that. You're familiar with this the Blue Note stuff. But it was released in 1972, and the original idea going into the album was to approach it entirely from the standpoint of having no, preconceptions, no conceived ideas about melodies or anything for the musicians to relate to, just to go into it and basically just throw some stuff at the wall and see what happens. And you can kind of pick up on a little bit of that because, again, there's a little bit of everything in here. There's some post-bop, again, fusion, funk, soul, a little bit of everything. A couple of times it really does sound like they're just throwing stuff against the wall, but as a finished product, it just works. And every change, every new track is a surprise. And it's just the entire time. And what keeps it together, really, for me, is just that Joe Henderson is the freaking man. George Cables, Ron Carter, Jack DeJohnette, David Holland, David Horowitz, Ralph McDonald, Artu Morera, and George Wadenius. I think I probably butchered a couple of those names. No doubt about it. Play on this record, and it's glorious. After listening to a tape copy of one of the sessions, Joe became aware of the further possibilities and used a 16-track tape to add to and improve the existing tracks, to go in and throw some additional touches on some of the songs to give it some of that sound where you wonder how it's doing so many things at once. That's because Joe became familiar with the 16-track tape round about that time and the possibilities. Like some of the great artists, became familiar with double tracking, like John Lennon. Very famous for double tracking. Kurt Cobain found out about that because John Lennon was a hero of his. I can keep naming more. But the 16 track was the key to creating so many different sounds for Black is the Color. The 70s were a decade of deep discovery for Joe. It was a decade for him to kind of step out of the shadow of the post-bop that he had become so, well known for and synonymous with, if you will. And to really branch out into other realms and possibilities for the genre of jazz. This album got bad reviews. I'm not going to lie. So if you become curious about this album from watching me, just do yourself a favor. Don't go look it up and look at the reviews. Because it came out in 1972, so it's not the traditional, the traditionalist jazz, which so many people who still reviewed jazz at the time were the traditionalists. So albums like this just got shit on. That's really just all there is to it. They just got shit on. So don't read those reviews. Look into it. Remember, your boy wouldn't steer you the wrong direction, and give it a open-minded listen. It's great, and in my opinion, everything that Joe put out on Milestone is great. Other ones to look into: Joe Henderson in Japan, In Pursuit of Blackness, big want for me. I actually don't have that one. That one's a big want for me. And The Elements, several great ones, but in my opinion, everything Joe put out on Milestone is great. Screw the critics. So that's one. Next up, I'm going to take down two albums at the same time. Again, relatively recent additions. Not that recent, but relatively recent. I've talked about them on a video before, if I'm not mistaken. But it's Gary Bart's Harlem Bush Music, Taifa, and Harlem Bush Music, Uhura. Albums that are meant to be listened to together, albums that are meant to complement one another. The music of both volumes of Harlem Bush Music, Taifa and Uhuru, is humbly dedicated, respectively, to the memories of Malcolm X and John Coltrane. And that's a direct quote from Gary Bartz, who is a jazz legend that is still with us. So cheers to you, Gary Bartz. Thank you for your wonderful contributions to music, for being one of the all-time greats, for being so influential. These are great albums. Couldn't possibly recommend them anymore. Ironically, it's kind of funny is I didn't do this on purpose, but these are also on Milestone, as the Joe Henderson album that I just showed you guys was. I didn't even realize I was doing that, but there we have it. And both, of course, the red labels. For the albums themselves, I wrote down a couple of quotes. I don't usually like to write down stuff, but these were a couple of quotes that I felt like, too well sum up the music. Excuse me, it's not a couple of quotes. What am I talking about? It's one quote. My bad. Ronnie D. Langford Jr. of AllMusic. How one finally looks at Harlem Bush music, is it music, politics, or something in between, matters less than understanding the time and place that it was made. And whether one ultimately finds these efforts by the Gary Bartz troupe satisfying or tiring matters less than appreciating the adventurous spirit that went into making them. I couldn't agree more. They're both funky as hell. They're both great jazz. Highly recommend both of them. I would highly recommend getting them into your life. They're not really all that expensive, but you don't see them all the time, if that makes any sense. But wonderful, wonderful records on Milestone. And again, for those of you who aren't familiar with Gary Bartz, he has great contributions to jazz. And again, can't put enough emphasis on this. He's a jazz legend that's still with us. Still with us. Born in 1940, still kicking in there. Cheers to you, Gary, and your wonderful contributions to music. So anyway, 3 down, couple to go. Next up, I want to talk about Art Ensemble of Chicago, Certain Blacks, on Intercity. This is a killer album. The A side of the album is Do What They Wanna. It's 24 minutes. That's the entire A side. It's a song called Do What They Wanna. Side 2 is 2 tracks, one for Jarman and Bye Bye Baby. Released in 1970. Art Ensemble themselves were formed in the 60s. And I think there was a tour in 1969 in which throughout the duration of the tour they used over 500 instruments. So this is a talented group of guys. Two of them of which are still with us, which I think is just awesome. Two of the guys still with us. I can't remember exactly the names of the two members that are still with us, but they're still with us. And not only are they still with us, but as of this year, still playing. And I think we're even on an album with some other artists this year. I can't remember the name of it, but I did look into it and become familiar with it not too long ago. And I've been meaning to check out the music. It would be very interesting to see what these, oh my God, talented musicians sound like after all these years. Ron Wynn at All Music said, called a classic with spicy and frenetic solos and in moments of cosmic overtones and clever melodies and rhythms. The next, the Art Ensemble at this point were becoming stars overseas and finding that going increasingly tougher in America. It's outside of avant-garde jazz with soul, heart, and funk. Yeah, ironically enough, the Art Ensemble of Chicago was not all that big in the States. Huge stars overseas. This is a great album. It's got some avant-garde again, as I just read to you, some free moments of free jazz, and a couple of moments where it surprises you with a little more funk and even, a little hint or two of post-bop. It's not there long. It's there long enough just to kind of catch your ears, to where you're like, oh, I wasn't expecting that coming, especially not after the A-side. After the A-side, you're not expecting to hear anything but avant-garde and free. So good. Again, this was on Intercity. Very good. I highly recommend it. If you don't have it, if you've never heard it, then you've got to get it into your life. Highly recommend it. Next up, final album I'll talk about today in my tribute to Black Music Month and 5 albums that I just feel like talking about is one that's going to be the most common to you of the group that I've spoken about, but I just couldn't help myself. I love the album so much. It's not going to be one everybody recognizes, but people who watch my videos are probably more than familiar with it by now. Of course, the iconic Lee Morgan in his Search for the New Land. It's original stereo pressing on Blue Note. You guys obviously know how I wagon wheel by now. And if you don't know, now you know. It is a miraculous album. Wayne Shorter, Grant Green, Herbie Hancock, Reginald Workman, Billy Higgins. A couple of interesting facts. Well, one in particular for me. Of course, you guys know I love them. I got to show the Blue Note label. I've just got to. You guys, interesting for me is the Sidewinder, which is probably Lee's most popular album. Some people's favorites. I got albums I like better than the Sidewinder, even though you can't deny its impact. Was released in 1963. This album, Search for the New Land, was actually recorded before the Sidewinder was released. And even though it was recorded in 64, it was shelved for 2 years for a 1966 release. And what's amazing about that to me is who in the hell hears this and shelves it? Oh my God. This is a monumental piece of jazz music, guys. Monumental. I don't know very many people that don't list it in the first 2 or 3 mentions of albums from Lee Morgan's discography. Pretty much every fan of Morgan, there's somebody who's as big a Morgan fan as I am, is going to mention it in the first 3 or 4. And Morgan put out a shitload of albums on Blue Note, guys. Even though he, of course, was tragically taken from us at the young age of 33 while performing in a nightclub. For those of you who want to hear more about that, of course, you can reference the documentary I called him Morgan, or you could reference, of course, one of my Tales from the Nightclub videos, the very first one that I did. You got to go back a few. You got to go back a couple dozen videos. But I did an entire video just on the tragic life and demise of the great and legendary Lee Morgan, the man that I believe to be the greatest trumpeter of all time. Definitely my favorite, if nothing else. If you've never heard this album, guys, I don't know what the hell you're waiting for, honestly. If you've never heard this and you care anything at all about jazz, you've got to get it. It's worth a blind buy. And the best thing about it for me is it really rewards repeated listening. There's a lot of albums you hear once or twice and you pretty much get the gist, honestly. I've heard this album hundreds of times, and every time I go back and listen to it, I catch something I didn't catch the last time. And it's like, oh man, that part right there. And it's just every time. Like, I just listened to it 30 minutes ago, and there were a couple of moments that hit me where I just smiled like, I just got that. And it's brilliant. And you gotta love an album that rewards repeated listenings, because it's far too rare these days for, you know, an album to reward repeated listenings. You kind of feel like you listen to an album once or twice and you get the gist, but not with this classic. And I highly recommend it. If you don't have it, if you've never heard it, then don't jump on it. Jump on it. You guys had to know that was coming. So anyway, happy Black Music Month to everybody, to all of you guys. I hope you celebrate by giving a listen to some of these albums I shared, or any great contribution or album by any African American artist. For those of you who weren't aware, it was Black Music Month. It is indeed, and these albums that I shared are more than worth a listen. Of course, obviously I love them all, and this is probably not the first video I'm going to do on this before the end of June. Probably not the last video I'm going to do on this topic before the end of June. So I guess I better hurry up. Until next time, until next video, hope you give these albums a listen. I hope you're enjoying your Thursday. And yeah, until next time, until next video, keep dropping that needle, you guys.